The year was 1918, and the heavy gray fog had rolled in off the ocean, covering the small coastal town in a blanket of damp silence that seemed to muffle the sounds of the waves crashing against the rocks below, making everything feel distant and soft, like a memory fading into the edges of a dream. The rain had been falling steadily for days now, a slow and rhythmic drumming against the slate roofs of the houses where the families stayed inside behind drawn curtains, waiting for the season of sickness to pass, with a patience that was born of necessity and a quiet resignation to the slow turning of the clock hands. In the front room of a weathered shingle house on the edge of the cliff, the fire in the hearth burned low, casting long, flickering shadows against the wallpaper that peeled slightly at the corners, revealing the layers of history beneath, just as the town itself revealed its history in the worn cobblestones of the streets and the moss growing on the brick walls. It was the time of the great influenza, a word whispered in hushed tones by the neighbors when they met briefly on the front steps to retrieve the deliveries left by the grocer's boy, who wore a heavy wool scarf pulled up over his nose and mouth to shield him from the mist. But inside the house there was no fear, only a profound sense of stillness, as if the air itself had paused to rest, and the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock, a steady and hypnotic rhythm that measured out the seconds and the minutes and the hours in a language that needed no translation. The tea kettle sat upon the iron stove in the kitchen, humming a low tune as the water inside began to boil, a process that seemed to take an eternity in the quiet afternoon, but there was no rush to be anywhere and no urgency to the task because the world outside had stopped moving and the streets were empty, save for the occasional delivery wagon passing by with its wheels creaking softly on the wet stones. The doctor's buggy was a familiar sight, a black carriage pulled by a tired bay horse that walked with its head down against the wind, its hooves making a rhythmic clip-clop sound that echoed off the walls of the silent houses and faded away into the fog, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and the wind sighing through the bare branches of the elms. To sit by the window and watch the fog was the only activity of the day, and it was a task that required no effort, only a willingness to let the mind wander and drift like a boat floating on the surface of a calm gray sea. The glass of the window pane was cold to the touch and streaked with rivulets of water that ran down in unpredictable paths, merging and separating and merging again until they reached the wooden sill where the paint was chipped and faded from years of salt air. Beyond the glass, the garden was a study in brown and gray, with the hydrangea bushes bowing their heavy heads under the weight of the water, and the dead leaves clinging stubbornly to the wet earth, glistening with moisture in the fading light of the afternoon. The smell of damp wool and burning coal permeated the air, a scent that was both comforting and heavy, reminding one of long winters past and the slow approach of the night when the days would grow shorter and the world would retreat even further into itself. In the kitchen, the water finally came to a boil, and the whistle of the kettle was a soft intrusion into the silence, a reminder that life continued in its small and mundane ways, even when the grand machinery of the world had ground to a halt. Pouring the water into the ceramic teapot was a ritual performed with slow and deliberate movements, watching the steam rise in curling ribbons that danced in the air before dissipating into nothingness, and the smell of dried chamomile and lemon balm filled the room, bringing with it a sense of warmth and healing. The cup was heavy in the hand, a comforting weight that anchored the body to the chair, while the mind continued to float in the space between waking and sleeping, a space where thoughts were as insubstantial as the fog outside, and where the worries of the sickness could not reach. Taking a sip of the hot tea felt like swallowing a piece of the hearth, the warmth spreading through the chest and down into the limbs, loosening the knots of tension that had gathered there, and inviting a heaviness into the eyelids that was hard to resist. The book lying open on the table was a dense volume of maritime history, its pages yellowed with age and smelling of dust and old paper, and the words printed there told stories of other times and other tides, where ships had sailed and waited, just as the people were waiting now. Reading the same sentence over and over again without truly understanding its meaning became a meditation, a way to focus the eyes while the brain rested, letting the shapes of the letters blur and swim until they were nothing more than ink on paper, devoid of meaning and stripped of their power to inform or instruct. Outside, the light began to fade, turning from the gray of polished steel to the deep blue of twilight, and the lamps flickered to life one by one, casting pools of yellow light onto the wet pavement, where the puddles reflected the glow like small mirrors scattered across the ground. The lamplighter was a shadow moving through the mist, a figure of routine and reliability in a world that felt uncertain, and his long pole reached up to the gas lamps with a practiced ease, igniting the flames that would stand guard against the darkness of the night. Watching him work was soothing, a reminder that there was order in the universe, and that the cycle of day and night continued uninterrupted, regardless of the fever that kept the people indoors and the silence that ruled the streets. The fire in the hearth settled with a soft shifting of embers, and a log crumbled into ash, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney, where they vanished into the cool air of the evening. It was time to close the heavy velvet curtains, to shut out the night and the rain and the empty street, and to turn inward to the safety of the warm room, where the shadows were friendly and the silence was a companion rather than a stranger. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder as the house grew quieter, the pendulum swinging back and forth with a steady, unhurried motion that matched the beating of the heart and the slow rhythm of the breath. In the corner of the room, the old cat sighed in his sleep, his paws twitching as he dreamed of chasing mice in a sunlit barn, far away from the rain and the gray skies and the sickness that kept the world at bay. The atmosphere was thick with a drowsiness that felt like a heavy woolen blanket pulled up to the chin, warm and suffocating in a pleasant way that made it impossible to think of anything else but the comfort of the moment and the promise of sleep. The history of the town was written in these moments of quiet endurance, when the shops were closed and the markets were empty, and the people waited in their homes for the tide to turn and the air to clear. But for now, there was only the waiting and the rain and the slow passage of time, marked by the ticking clock and the fading light and the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping house. The furniture in the room stood like silent sentinels, the heavy mahogany sideboard and the plush armchair and the writing desk with its surface cluttered with unwritten letters and dried inkwells, all of them witnessing the passage of the hours with a stoic indifference that was strangely comforting. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light that escaped from the gap in the curtains, swirling in slow, chaotic patterns that seemed to mimic the movement of the stars in the night sky, vast and unknowable and utterly silent. The sensation of the chair beneath the body was solid and real, a grounding force in a world that felt increasingly dreamlike, and the texture of the fabric against the skin was rough and warm, a tactile reminder of existence in the midst of the void. Thoughts drifted by like clouds in a summer sky, fluffy and white and formless, changing shape with every passing moment, and never lingering long enough to be examined or understood. There was a memory of a picnic on the cliffs long ago, before the sickness came, when the sun shone bright and hot on the grass, and the air was filled with the sound of seagulls and the laughter of children playing by the water. But that memory felt distant now, like a story read in a book rather than something lived and experienced. The reality of the present was the gray light and the rain and the quiet room, and the feeling of heavy limbs and heavy eyes, and a mind that was slowly shutting down, one window at a time. The concept of tomorrow seemed abstract and far away,
a concept that belonged to a different world, where time moved quickly and things happened with a sense of urgency. But here, in this room, in this moment, there was only the eternal now, stretching out in all directions, like a calm sea under a windless sky.
The sound of the wind picking up outside was a low moan that rattled the window frames gently, a lullaby sung by the earth itself to soothe its children to sleep. And the rain intensified its drumming against the glass, creating a wall of white noise that blocked out every other sound and every other thought. It was a perfect isolation, a cocoon of safety spun from rain and mist and silence, where nothing could hurt and nothing could demand attention, and the only requirement was to exist and to breathe and to let go. The body felt heavy, sinking deeper into the cushion of the chair, the muscles relaxing one by one, starting from the toes and moving up through the legs and the back and the shoulders, until the whole frame was limp and at rest. The eyelids fluttered and closed, shutting out the flickering firelight and the shadows on the wall, leaving only the darkness behind the eyes, a darkness that was soft and velvety and full of potential. The breath became shallow and even, a slow intake of air followed by a long, slow exhale that carried away the last remnants of tension and worry, leaving the mind empty and clear and ready for sleep. In the distance, the church bell tolled the hour, a deep and resonant sound that vibrated through the air and through the walls of the house, counting out the time that no longer mattered. 8, 9, 10 tolls that faded into the silence, leaving no trace behind. The town slept under the blanket of rain, the rows of houses dark and quiet, the streets empty and wet, the harbor cold and still, the lighthouse sweeping its beam silently across the water, all of it united in a great peaceful slumber that healed and restored. The sickness was there, yes, but it was just a part of the landscape, like the rain and the fog, a temporary condition that would pass in time, leaving the world washed clean and ready to begin again. But that was for later, for the future that had not yet arrived, and for now there was only the peace of the present, the comfort of the warm room, the sound of the rain, and the irresistible pull of sleep. The mind drifted further away, detaching from the physical world, floating in a space of pure consciousness where there were no words and no images, only a sense of being and a deep, profound rest. It was a sleep that went down to the bone, a sleep that knitted together the raveled sleeve of care, a sleep that was as deep and as old as the ocean. And so the night wore on, with the rain falling and the wind blowing and the world turning slowly on its axis, carrying the sleepers through the dark hours towards the dawn that would come eventually, but not yet, not for a long time. There was no need to wake, no need to stir, no need to do anything but drift and dream in the safety of the silent house, in the quiet town, in the middle of the gray and rainy season. The candle on the table sputtered and went out, its wick drowning in a pool of melted wax, releasing a thin trail of smoke that smelled of beeswax and burned string, adding another layer to the sensory tapestry of the room. The darkness was complete now, save for the dying embers in the fireplace, which glowed with a dull red light, like the eyes of a sleepy dragon guarding its hoard of silence and peace. The temperature in the room dropped slightly, but the warmth of the tea and the heavy clothes kept the chill at bay, creating a cozy microclimate that was perfectly suited for hibernation. Even the mice in the walls were quiet, their scratching and skittering silenced by the heavy atmosphere of the night, leaving the house in a state of absolute stillness that was rare and precious. To listen to such silence was a gift, a chance to hear the blood rushing in the ears and the slow, steady beat of the heart, the internal rhythm of life that continued regardless of the external circumstances. It was a reminder that life was resilient, that it could endure the rain and the cold and the sickness and emerge on the other side intact and whole.
But such profound thoughts were too heavy for a mind on the edge of sleep, and they slipped away like sand through fingers, leaving behind only a vague sense of reassurance and well-being. The boundaries of the room seemed to dissolve, the walls melting away into the darkness, the ceiling lifting off to reveal the infinite expanse of the night sky, the floor dropping away to leave the body floating in a void of comfort and safety. It was a return to the womb, a return to the source, a return to the primal state of existence where there was no separation between the self and the universe, only a seamless unity of being. The dreams that came were slow and abstract, devoid of plot or character, consisting only of colors and shapes and feelings, soft waves of warmth, gentle currents of air that lifted and carried the spirit effortlessly through the night. There was no fear in these dreams, no anxiety, no conflict, only a gentle exploration of the inner landscape, a wandering through the gardens of the subconscious, where the flowers bloomed in silence and the rivers flowed without a sound. The night deepened, the rain continued to fall, the wind continued to blow, and the world continued to sleep, held in the embrace of a peace that passed all understanding. And in the morning, when the light returned, it would be a soft and gentle light, filtering through the clouds and the mist, waking the world slowly and kindly, without the harsh glare of the sun, allowing the sleepers to rise gradually from the depths of their rest, refreshed and renewed, and ready to face whatever the new day might bring. But morning was still hours away, a distant promise on the horizon, and for now the night reigned supreme, the undisputed ruler of the earth and the sky and the soul. The rhythm of the rain was the heartbeat of the night, a steady pulse that sustained the world in its slumber, a lullaby that never ended, a story that had no beginning and no conclusion, only a continuous flow of sound and sensation that wrapped around the mind and guided it gently down into the dark. The morning light filtered through the green and amber glass bottles in the window of the apothecary shop, casting long, colored shadows across the worn wooden floorboards that creaked softly under the weight of the silence. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling of dried peppermint and valerian root, and the faint, sharp tang of rubbing alcohol, a scent that was clean and medicinal and strangely reassuring. The shop was a sanctuary of order in a world that felt chaotic, with rows upon rows of ceramic tars lining the high shelves, each one labeled with black letters in a steady hand, identifying contents like willow bark and licorice and slippery elm. The old pharmacist stood behind the high oak counter, his white coat starched and stiff, moving with a slowness that came from decades of measuring and mixing. He reached for a heavy glass jar on the shelf behind him, the movement smooth and practiced, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the glass before lifting it down with a quiet clink. Removing the stopper released a puff of fine dust into the air, and the smell of dried sage filled the small space between the counter and the wall. He placed a small amount of the dried leaves into a stone mortar, the rough interior gray and worn smooth in the center from years of use. He picked up the heavy pestle, its handle polished by the grip of his hand, and began to grind. The sound was a low, rhythmic scratching, stone against stone, a friction that transformed the leaves into powder. Grind and turn, grind and turn. It was a sound that had been heard in this room for 50 years, a sound that meant healing and preparation. The dust from the herbs rose in a small cloud, caught in a shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom. He worked without hurry, his eyes focused on the bottom of the mortar, watching the texture change, watching the coarse leaves become fine dust. There was no need to rush, because the sickness would run its course, and the medicine would be ready when it was ready. He stopped to check the consistency, tapping the pestle against the rim of the bowl. Tap, 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 a sharp sound that echoed briefly and then died away. He reached for the brass scales that sat on the counter,
their pans hanging perfectly balanced in the still air. He placed a tiny weight on one side, a piece of brass no bigger than a bean. He used a small silver scoop to transfer the powder onto the other pan, watching the needle swing slowly to the left and then to the right, seeking the point of equilibrium. The balance was delicate, requiring patience and a steady hand. When the pans were level, he nodded to himself, a small gesture of satisfaction. He took a square of white paper from a stack and creased it down the middle, creating a trough for the powder. He poured the medicine onto the paper, the fine dust sliding down the crease. Folding the paper was an art form, folding the bottom up and the sides in and the top down, creating a small, neat packet that contained the dose. He did this again and again, filling 12 packets with the same slow precision. Fold and tuck.
Fold and tuck. The paper crinkled softly, a dry sound like autumn leaves. He took a piece of thin twine and tied the packets together in a bundle, the knot secure and tight. The shop was quiet, save for the rustle of the paper and the breathing of the man. Outside, the rain continued to drizzle against the glass, blurring the view of the empty street. A cat slept on the windowsill, its tail twitching occasionally, undisturbed by the activity. The apothecary was a place of waiting, a place where time was measured in grains and drops. He picked up a bottle of blue glass and held it up to the light, checking for clarity. The liquid inside was thick and syrupy, moving slowly when he tilted the bottle. He wiped the glass with a clean cloth, removing a smudge of dust, polishing it until it shone. He placed it on the counter next to the paper packets. The work was done for the moment. He leaned his elbows on the counter and looked out at the rain. There were no customers yet, no one braving the wet morning, just the gray light and the wet stones. He felt a deep sense of calm, a feeling that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. The ticking of the clock on the wall was a slow, steady companion. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It marked the passing of the morning, the passing of the epidemic, the passing of time itself. The smell of the herbs was a comfort, a reminder of the earth and its power to heal. The rows of jars stood like soldiers on the shelves, silent and ready. The mortar sat empty, waiting for the next mixture. The pestle rested beside it. The scales were balanced. Everything was in its place. Everything was still. The world outside was wet and cold, but in here it was dry and ordered. The pharmacist closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence. He heard the drip of a tap in the back room. He heard the settling of the floorboards. He heard the wind gently rattling the door frame. These were the sounds of his life, the soundtrack of his service. He opened his eyes and straightened a stack of labels on the counter. He dipped a pen into an inkwell and began to write on a label, the scratch of the nib loud in the quiet room. Take 1 powder at bedtime. The letters were formed with loops and swirls, a script from another century. He blotted the ink and stuck the label onto a box. It was a small act of care, a message sent into the future. The morning wore on, slow and gray. The light shifted across the floor. The cat stretched and went back to sleep. The pharmacist stood at his post, a guardian of the remedies, a watcher in the apothecary. And the silence held, deep and fragrant and peaceful. The wooden door of the apothecary closed with a soft click, and the mist swirled around the ankles as the walk continued down the wet pavement towards the brick building on the corner, which stood solid and square against the gray sky, with the words United States Post Office painted in gold letters on the window glass that was fogged with the condensation of the morning. Inside, the air was completely different from the sharp medicinal scent of the pharmacy. Instead, it smelled of dry paper and dusty canvas bags, and the faint sweet odor of mucilage glue and old ink, a smell that was dry and quiet and spoke of silence and long distances. The floor was made of worn pine planks that had been swept clean of the mud, leaving only the smooth grain of the wood exposed, and the only sound in the high-ceilinged room was the slow, rhythmic thumping of the postmaster's hand stamp as he canceled the postage on the outgoing mail. Thump, ink, thump. It was a sound that marked the passage of time more accurately than any clock, a steady beat that echoed softly off the rows of brass mailboxes that lined the wall like a honeycomb of metal eyes. The postmaster stood behind the sorting table, a surface of polished oak that was worn down in the center from the friction of millions of envelopes sliding across it over the years. He wore a visor of green celluloid to shade his eyes from the single electric bulb that hung from a cord above his head, casting a cone of yellow light onto the stacks of mail. He reached for a letter from the pile on his left, his hand moving with a slow, practiced efficiency that wasted no energy. He held the envelope up to the light, checking the address, peering through his wire-rimmed spectacles at the handwriting, which was sometimes looped and elegant and sometimes cramped and shaky. He read the name of the town aloud in a whisper that was barely a breath. Springfield. He turned and slotted the letter into one of the wooden pigeonholes on the wall behind him, the paper making a soft shushing sound as it slid into its place. Slide. Stop. He reached for the next one. Peoria. Slide. Stop. The rhythm was hypnotic, a dance of hand and eye and paper. There was no hurry here, no rush to get the mail out, because the trains were running slow due to the rain and the sickness, and the world had learned to wait. The letters were small packets of hope and mundane news, sealed with wax or a lick of glue. Some were white, some were cream, some were a pale blue that looked gray in the dim light. They contained words about the weather, about the price of corn, about the health of aunts and uncles, words that would be read in quiet rooms by lamplight days from now. But here they were just objects to be sorted, to be categorized, to be sent on their way. The postmaster picked up a bundle of letters tied with rough twine, the string biting slightly into the edges of the envelopes. He untied the knot with nimble fingers, the string falling away to be used again later. He spread the letters out like a fan of cards. He took the cancellation stamp, a heavy wooden handle with a rubber base, and pressed it into the ink pad. Squish. Then onto the stamp in the corner of the envelope. Thump. The image of George Washington was covered by the black wavy lines of the cancellation mark. It was a small act of finality, a mark that said, "This journey has begun." Thump. Ink. Thump. The sound was dull and comforting, a heartbeat of the bureaucracy. Dust motes floated in the cone of light, swirling in slow eddies every time a letter was moved. The postmaster watched them for a moment, his mind drifting to the dust on the road, to the dust in the fields. Then he went back to the work. Another letter, another town, Decatur, slide, stop. The repetition was a balm for the mind, a way to shut out the gray day outside. The rain tapped against the high windows, a soft patter that came and went with the wind. Inside, the stove in the corner creaked as the metal expanded and contracted with the heat. It was a potbelly stove, made of cast iron, sitting on a square of brick. The fire inside was low, just enough to take the chill off the damp air. The smell of the coal smoke mixed with the paper smell, creating a unique scent to this room. A fly buzzed lazily against the glass of the service window, bumping softly against the pane, trying to get to the gray light outside. Buzz, bump, buzz, bump. The postmaster ignored it, focused on the stack of mail, which seemed to neither grow nor shrink, but simply exist. He picked up a postcard, a picture of a seaside hotel with flags flying in a wind that wasn't blowing here. He turned it over and read the message, which was brief. Arrived safely. Weather is fine. Wish you were here. He stamped it. Thump. He slotted it. Slide. It joined the others in the dark wooden box. The solitude of the post office was profound. There were no customers at the window, no one buying stamps, no one asking for general delivery. Everyone was at home, staying safe, staying dry. The postmaster was the custodian of their connections, the keeper of their words. He felt the weight of the responsibility, but it was a light weight, a paper weight. He paused to wipe his glasses, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and rubbing the lenses in slow circles. The world blurred for a moment, becoming a smear of brown and gold, then snapped back into focus when he put the frames back on his nose. He took a sip of water from a glass on the ledge, the water cool and tasting of the iron pipes. He looked at the wall clock. 10:30. The morning was stretching out, pulling itself thin. He went back to the sorting. A large brown envelope this time, thick with documents. It required a larger slot, a different movement. He found the place and pushed it in. The friction of the paper was louder this time, a rasping sound. He smoothed the stack of remaining letters, tapping the edges on the table to align them. Tap, tap, tap. A sense of order in a disordered world. He picked up a letter with a stamp that had been placed upside down. He smiled faintly, a microscopic shift of the facial muscles, and then stamped it. Thump. It didn't matter. The mail would go through. The rain increased in intensity for a moment, drumming.
The bag was stamped with the words U.S. Mail in faded black ink. He repeated the process for the next town. Stack, wrap, tie, snip. It was a different rhythm, a slower rhythm. The canvas bag began to fill up, a heavy mass of communication. The smell of the canvas was dusty and dry, like old hay. The postmaster worked without rushing, his movements fluid and efficient. He was a machine made of flesh and wool and patience. He thought about the train that would carry these bags, the steam engine chugging through the rain, the wheels clicking on the tracks. He thought about the mail car, the clerk sorting these bundles again, throwing them into new slots. It was a chain of sorting, a never-ending river of paper flowing across the country. He finished the last bundle and dropped it into the bag. Thud. A soft sound of completion. He pulled the drawstring of the bag tight and secured it. He dragged the bag to the door, ready for the pickup wagon. The sound of the heavy bag dragging across the floor was a low growl. Scrah. He stood up and stretched his back, feeling the vertebrae pop softly. He walked to the window and looked out. The street was empty, a river of wet bricks. The shop across the way was closed, its shades drawn. The town was asleep, or waiting. He turned back to the room. The sorting table was empty now, the oak surface shining in the light. Dust motes settled on the wood. The ink pad was closed. The stamp was resting. The work was done for now, but there would be more. There was always more. He sat down on a high stool behind the counter and rested his chin in his hand. He listened to the silence. He listened to the rain. He listened to the stove. He watched the minute hand of the clock move imperceptibly forward. Time was a physical thing here, something that could be watched and measured. The atmosphere was heavy with drowsiness, the kind of sleepy feeling that comes on rainy mornings in warm rooms. His eyes grew heavy. He let them close, just for a moment. He listened to the hum of the light bulb, a tiny vibration in the air. He smelled the paper. He smelled the ink. He drifted on the sea of silence. The post office was a ship sailing through the fog, carrying its cargo of words. He was the captain and the crew. He was the guardian of the quiet. The stillness was absolute. No phones rang, no voices spoke, just the rain, the endless, soothing rain. The walls of the room seemed to move closer,
protecting him, wrapping him in a box of dry air. He breathed in slowly. He breathed out slowly. The rhythm of his breath matched the rhythm of the room. It was a perfect stasis, a moment of balance. The world outside could rain and storm, but in here it was dry and calm. In here there was only the paper and the twine and the peace, the slow, dusty peace of the post office in the middle of the long, gray morning. The heavy oak door of the library swung open on well-oiled hinges, admitting a guest into a world that was even quieter than the street outside, a world where the air was still and warm and smelled intensely of old paper and leather bindings and the faint sweet scent of vanilla, which is the smell of books that have been sitting on shelves for decades, decomposing slowly into dust. The library was a high-ceilinged room lined from floor to rafters with dark wooden shelves that held thousands of volumes, standing in rigid rows like silent soldiers guarding the knowledge of the centuries. The floor was covered in a thick runner of maroon carpet that absorbed the sound of footsteps, making every movement feel stealthy and secretive. The librarian sat behind a massive desk near the entrance, a woman of indeterminate age with spectacles perched on the end of her nose and a gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders to ward off the dampness of the rainy day. She looked up briefly over the rims of her glasses, offering a small nod acknowledgement, before returning her attention to the ledger open before her, where she was recording the return of a book with a scratchy dip pen. Scratch, scratch. The sound was the only disturbance in the vast room, a tiny friction that emphasized the silence rather than breaking it. Walking past the desk was like entering a cathedral of silence, where speaking aloud felt like a sin, and even breathing seemed too loud. The shelves created long, narrow aisles that stretched back into the shadows, dim tunnels of literature that smelled of dry glue and history. Walking down the biography aisle, the fingers trailed lightly along the spines of the books, feeling the different textures, the rough cloth, the smooth leather, the embossed gold lettering that spelled out the names of great men and women who were long gone. Napoleon, Lincoln, Victoria. Their lives were compressed into pages, trapped between covers, waiting for someone to open them and let them out. But for now, they slept. The light in the aisles was dim, provided by small electric bulbs that hung from the ceiling in green glass shades, casting pools of emerald light onto the floor. Dust motes danced in the beams, swirling in slow motion, disturbed by the passage of the walker. The dust in the library was different from the dust in the road. It was a clean dust, a dust made of ideas and words. At the end of the aisle, there was a rolling ladder attached to a brass rail that ran along the top of the shelves. The ladder was made of polished oak and had wheels that squeaked softly when it was moved. Squeak, squeak. It was a tool for reaching the high shelf where the obscure books lived, the ones that were rarely checked out, the treatises on ancient agriculture, and the collections of sermons from the 18th century. To climb the ladder was to rise above the world, to find a perch among the forgotten words. But there was no need to climb today, only a need to wander. The fiction section was in the center of the room, the books here showing more wear, the spines cracked and faded from being held in many hands. A book by Dickens lay on a small table left by a previous patron. It was closed, the cover worn at the corners. Picking it up felt like shaking hands with an old friend. The pages were soft like fabric, turning silently under the thumb. Chapter 1, Fog Everywhere. It was a fitting story for a day like this. The reader placed the book back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. Order was important here. Everything had a place. The Dewey Decimal System was the law of the land, a numerical code that organized the universe of thought. 300 for social sciences, 500 for science, 800 for literature. It was a comforting structure, a way to make sense of the chaos. Moving deeper into the library, the silence grew heavier. This was the reference section, where the encyclopedias lived, heavy volumes bound in black that contained the sum of human knowledge up to the year 1918. They sat on sturdy shelves, immovable and authoritative. A large dictionary lay open on a stand, its pages thin as onion skin. The definition of the word silence, absence of sound, stillness, peace. The reader turned the page, the paper making a crinkling sound. Shh. The next word was silk, a fine, soft thread. The associations drifted through the mind. Silk, silence, soft, sleep. The rain beat against the tall arched windows at the back of the library, a muffled drumming that sounded like fingers tapping on a drum. The glass was old and wavy, distorting the view of the garden outside, turning the trees into green blurs. A window seat was built into the alcove, upholstered in worn velvet of a dusty blue color. It was the perfect place to sit and watch the rain. Sinking into the cushion, the body relaxed completely, supported by the wood and the wall. The view was the back garden, a small enclosed space with a stone bench and a dripping fountain. A bird sat on the rim of the fountain, shaking water from its wings, a robin, perhaps, or a sparrow.
It flew away, leaving the garden empty. The reader leaned the head back against the window frame, feeling the cold glass through the hair. The contrast between the cold glass and the warm room was pleasant. The steam radiator under the seat hissed softly, releasing heat into the air. Hiss, clank. It was the breathing of the building. The library was a living organism, a creature of brick and mortar and paper. The smell of the radiator was metallic and hot, mixing with the vanilla scent of the books. It was a soporific blend, a perfume of drowsiness. The eyelids grew heavy. The lines of the bookshelves began to blur. The spine of a red book merged with the spine of a blue book. The titles became illegible. The mind let go of the need to read, let go of the need to know. There was only the feeling of being safe, safe among the stories, safe from the rain, safe from the sickness. The librarian turned a page of her ledger, the sound carrying all the way to the back of the room. It was a gentle reminder that time was still passing, but it was passing slowly here. Minutes stretched into hours. The light shifted on the floor, moving inch by inch as the sun moved behind the clouds. A shadow crept across the rug, swallowing the pattern of vines and flowers. The reader watched the shadow move, a slow tide of darkness. It was hypnotic, watching the light change, watching the dust swirl, watching the rain fall. There was no boredom here, only a deep appreciation for the lack of events. To do nothing was a luxury, to simply be. The thoughts slowed down, matching the rhythm of the rain. Drip, drop, drip, drop. A thought about dinner, a thought about a letter, a thought about sleep. They floated by like the dust motes. The library was a time capsule, preserving the past, holding it in stasis. The words in the books did not change. They waited. They were patient, just like the town was patient, waiting for the sun, waiting for health, waiting for the future. The reader closed the eyes for a moment, just to rest them. The darkness behind the lids was warm and gray. The sound of the radiator became a white noise, a hum that blocked out the world. The sound of the rain became a lullaby. Sleep was close, hovering on the edges of consciousness. It would be easy to drift off here in the window seat, surrounded by the wisdom of the ages. To sleep in a library was to sleep in the center of the mind, to dream of words and worlds. The librarian coughed softly, a polite sound that did not disturb the peace. She was a guardian of the quiet, a keeper of the stillness. The reader opened the eyes again, slowly, reluctant to leave the inner world. The library was the same. The books were the same. The rain was the same. It was a constant, a fixed point in a turning world. The leather of the window seat creaked as the weight shifted. The fabric was soft under the fingers. The texture of the velvet, the texture of the paper, the texture of the silence. It was a tactile experience, a sensory bath. The afternoon was waning.
The light was fading. The green shades of the lamps glowed brighter. It was time to move, time to leave this sanctuary and return to the house. But not yet. Just a few more minutes. A few more minutes of peace. A few more minutes of the smell of old books. A few more minutes of the rain. The reader stood up slowly, stretching the limbs, feeling the stiffness of the rest. Walking back through the aisles was a slow procession, passing the history section, passing the science section, passing the fiction section, saying goodbye to the books. Goodbye, Napoleon. Goodbye, Lincoln. Goodbye, Dickens. They stood silent on their shelves, watching the departure. The floor creaked near the desk, a final sound of presence. The librarian looked up again, peering over her glasses. She smiled a small, tight smile. "Good day," she whispered. "Good day," the reader whispered back. The voice sounded loud and strange after the long silence. The hand touched the brass handle of the door. The metal was cold. Turning the handle released the latch with a click. The door swung open, admitting the sound of the rain and the smell of the wet street. Stepping out was like stepping into a different world, a world of motion and water. But the peace of the library remained, carried inside like a hidden book, a volume of silence, tucked away in the heart. The door closed behind, cutting off the scent of vanilla and leaving the reader on the pavement in the mist, ready to walk home through the gray and quiet town that slept under the blanket of the rain.
The beans hit the scale pan with a clatter, rain on a tin roof. Clatter, clatter, clatter. The weighing was precise. The transfer to the bag was noisy. Then came the grinder. The shopkeeper poured the beans into the hopper of the large red wheel grinder that stood at the end of the counter. He turned the heavy iron handle. Crunch, grind, crunch, grind. The noise was a mechanical chewing, a destruction of the bean to release the heart. The smell intensified, filling the entire shop, masking the scent of the spices and the soap. It was a comforting smell, a smell of mornings and warmth. The grinding stopped. The drawer at the bottom was pulled out, filled with dark, fragrant grounds. They were poured into a bag which was folded and tied. Snip! The two packages sat on the counter side by side, flour and coffee, white and black, staples of the kitchen. The customer turned to look around the store while the shopkeeper wrote the prices on a ledger with a pencil. The shelves were a museum of daily life. There were jars of penny candy, clear glass filled with peppermint sticks and lemon drops and licorice whips, colors that shone like jewels. There were boxes of starch and tins of baking powder. There were bottles of vanilla extract and jugs of vinegar. In the back, there were bolts of fabric stacked like logs, calico and gingham and wool. The patterns were simple, small flowers and checks waiting to be turned into dresses and curtains. A woman was standing by the fabric, touching a piece of blue flannel, rubbing the material between her thumb and forefinger, testing the weight and the warmth. She did not speak. She just felt the cloth, her face thoughtful. The sound of the rain on the metal roof of the store was a steady drumming, a percussion section for the silence. It was a comforting sound, a sound that made the indoors feel safer and the outdoors feel further away. A cat lay on top of a barrel of apples, a large tabby with paws tucked underneath its chest. It opened one green eye to watch the customer, then closed it again, dismissing the intrusion. The shopkeeper cleared his throat, a soft rumble. "That will be 40 cents. The money was counted out, coins clinking onto the wooden counter. A quarter, a dime, a nickel. The shopkeeper swept them into his hand and pressed the key on the cash register. Ring! The drawer popped open with a mechanical slide. The coins were dropped into their slots. Clink, clink, clink. The drawer was pushed shut. Thud. The transaction was complete. But there was no rush to leave. The store was a shelter, a place to pause. The customer walked over to the stove, which radiated a dry heat that smelled of cast iron and ash. Holding out hands to the warmth, feeling the blood circulate in the fingertips, The heat was a physical presence, a wall against the damp. On the shelf next to the stove was a row of glass jars filled with dried spices, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon sticks. The colors were warm browns and rust reds. The labels were handwritten in fading ink. The visual clutter of the store was pleasing to the eye, a texture of abundance in a time of scarcity. There was enough here, enough to eat, enough to wear, enough to live. It was a reassuring thought. The shopkeeper leaned back against the shelves, crossing his arms. He looked out the window at the rain. He was a fixture of the store, as permanent as the counter. He didn't need to speak to communicate. His presence was enough. The wind rattled the window pane gently, a reminder of the storm outside. The customer picked up the packages, the paper rough and cool against the hands. The weight was good. 5 pounds of flour, 1 pound of coffee. It was a burden of sustenance. Walking towards the door, the floorboards creaked again, a farewell groan. The woman by the fabric turned and smiled, a brief, shy smile. "Good day, good day." The bell on the door jingled again, ling, 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 as it opened. The cool, moist air of the street rushed in, mixing with the coffee and the spices. Stepping out onto the porch, the roof overhead offered a moment of shelter before facing the rain. The street was still empty, the mist was still thick, but the arms were full and the heart was quiet. The walk home would be wet, but the destination was warm. The general store remained behind, a glowing box of goods in the gray afternoon, a repository of the things that sustain life, a quiet corner of the world where time was weighed in ounces and pounds and measured in the slow turning of the grinder handle. The walk back from the general store was a retracing of steps across the wet cobblestones that glistened like the backs of black whales surfacing in the sea of the street, the puddles now connecting to form small streams that ran down towards the harbor, carrying with them the dust of the day and the leaves of the autumn. The brown paper packages were held tight against the chest to protect them from the drizzle, the warmth of the coffee beans radiating slightly through the paper, a small comfort against the chill wind that had begun to blow in from the east. The house appeared out of the mist, a gray shape becoming solid, the white trim around the window standing out against the gloom like a welcoming smile. Reaching the front porch was a relief, the wooden boards echoing with a hollow thud under the boots, the roof overhead cutting off the direct assault of the rain, leaving only the damp air to contend with. The key was fished from a pocket, the metal cold and slippery in the wet fingers, finding the keyhole by touch as much as by sight, the metal scraping against the brass plate before sliding home with a satisfying click. Turning the key required a firm twist, the lock tumbling over, heavy and secure. The door swung inward, pushing a wave of still dry air to meet the wet air of the porch. Stepping across the threshold was like stepping across a border between two countries, the country of the storm and the country of the hearth. The door was closed and locked, the bolt sliding home with a heavy clunk that shut out the world. The silence of the house was waiting, a patient presence that filled the hallway. The first task was to shed the layers of the outside. The packages were placed on the small table by the door, the paper making a crinkle sound as it settled. The heavy wool coat was unbuttoned slowly, starting from the collar and working down the stiff fabric, resisting the finger slightly. 1 button, 2 buttons, 3 buttons. The coat was shrugged off, the heavy weight lifting from the shoulders, leaving a feeling of lightness and freedom. The wool was damp and smelled of wet sheep and rain, a scent that belonged in the hallway and not in the parlor. It was hung on the coat rack, the wooden peg taking the weight, the empty sleeves hanging down like the arms of a ghost. The hat was placed on the shelf above, the brim dripping a single drop of water on the floor. Plip! Next were the boots. Sitting on the small wooden bench by the door involved a bending of the knees and a sigh of effort. The laces were wet and tight, requiring patience to untie, picking at the knots with fingernails, loosening the leather loops one by one until the tongue of the boot could be pulled forward. The foot was withdrawn, the sock sliding against the leather heel. The release of pressure was immediate, a rush of blood returning to the toes. The second boot followed the first.
They were placed side by side on the rubber mat, wet sentinels guarding the door. Standing in stocking feet felt intimate and quiet, the floorboards transmitting the temperature of the house directly to the skin. The packages were retrieved and carried into the kitchen, the paper bag of flour settling with a soft thump on the counter, the coffee beans placed beside it. The kitchen was dim, the light from the window fading fast as the afternoon turned into evening. It was time to wake the house up, time to bring back the light and the warmth. The first stop was the fireplace in the front room, where the earlier fire had burned down to a bed of gray ash and faint red embers. Kneeling on the hearthrug was a humble posture, a devotion to the flame. The poker was used to stir the ashes, revealing the sleeping heat beneath. A handful of dried pine needles and a few twists of newspaper were placed on the coals. The crackle was immediate, a sharp snapping sound as the resin in the needles caught fire.